Radio for the masses.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
If the game is rigged, change the game. Game changer.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
This is Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Radio Network.
All right. Good evening. How you doing? How you doing, Fade to Black? Yeah, it's kicking off another brand new week and very excited about everything that we've got going on around here. Today is Monday, March 17th, 2025. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. Tonight is our annual St. Patrick's Day special event. So let's do this, man. And you know what to do. Help support the show. Everything that we do around here. Just get yourself a Fade to Black t-shirt. We have 2 shirts, 2 ways to get them, 2 links below. This week on Fade to Black, kicking off with things tonight, we have Morgan Daimler with us, and it is St. Patrick's Day. So we're going to talk about everything St. Patrick and Irish and all of those myths and everything around it. Tomorrow night, Chris Matthew is back with us. He's got a new film out. It is called Doors of Perception. And then Wednesday night, Sean McNamara is here. We're going to be talking about the world of telepathy. And then Thursday night, Dr. Scott Kolbaba is with us. And we're going to talk about his research into doctors and near-death experiences. All of that on Thursday night. So we've got a big week coming up. And I do have 5 major events. And the next one is next week. Rise of the Guardians, March 29th through 30th, 2025 in Sedona, Arizona. Links are below. And then I head to the Midwest for the Contact Modalities Expo, May 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, 2025 in Delavan, Wisconsin at Delavan Lake. And then I come back here for Contact in the Desert, May 29th through June 2nd, Palm Springs, California. Then I head south to Peru for the Inca Celebration of the Sun with Brian Forrester, and that is June 17th through the 27th, 2025. I do want to let everybody know this tour is sold out, but we have a second tour coming up in November. The links for that are below. And then I go to the East Coast for the Psi Games, the Psychic Olympics, August 1st through the 3rd, 2025 in Charlottesville, Virginia. Again, the links for everything that I'm doing are below. We'll see you out there in 2025. All right. Well, it's St. Patrick's Day tonight. Morgan Daimler is with us, and we are going to jump into the folklore behind it, and we're going to talk fairies, my favorite subject, gnomes, leprechauns, and the mysteries of Irish mythology. We're going to do all of that because she's a teacher and I am a student. All of her links are below. We've got them over on our website and throughout social media. And I would like to welcome to Fade to Black, Morgan Daimler. She's right there. Good evening. How you doing?
Thank you for having me on your show.
This is going to be great.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's pick up the excitement, young lady. Hey, just kidding. We had a great conversation before the show, and I found out a few things about Morgan. We don't have to talk about them on the show, but she's a heavy metal bass player. Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. We talked about Dimebag Darrell. You get the first time guest disclaimer. Okay. So next time you're on the show, we're not going to do it, but we're going to do it now, which is this, Morgan. It's just you and I sitting on my couch having a conversation as friends. Where the conversation starts, it starts. Where it ends. But we're going to end as friends. Now, you have to accept so we can move on.
Accepted.
Okay, man. What kind of tense moment was that? What kind of, okay. All right. Here we are. is St. Patrick's Day your favorite holiday?
So I have a bit of a soft spot for it. I know it can be a little controversial. Some people have strong feelings about it. I grew up in the Irish American diaspora. My grandfather was from Ireland. And so my dad grew up with a lot of the culture. So then I grew up with a lot of the culture. And St. Patrick's Day was kind of like Irish American Pride Day for me
Yeah.
growing up. We would always have the very stereotypical corned beef and cabbage dinner, which people in Ireland don't do that, but we do it here.
Right.
And we would try to go out and do something cultural, like we'd see a traditional music show or, just something connected to it. And we'd tell family stories and all of that. So it's just something that I've always had a lot of affinity for, because to me, it has all these family memories layered in it.
What about bar hopping at 8 a.m.?
That is a popular way to celebrate the holiday.
Where did that come from? I mean, we're going to get into mythology tonight and other stuff, but here in LA, and for a long time, I was on the local talk station here, and KFI, it's a big station. So I would always have it on in my car because, I was one of the hosts on the station. So but St. Patrick's Day, they would, and it would blow my mind. I'd be driving around and they would go, okay, let's go live to Bob. He's at Irish 32 in Burbank. And what's going on there, Bob? Oh, man, everybody started drinking about a half hour ago. And I'm thinking, and they would go from bar to bar, right? Different correspondents. I'm like, who's getting plowed on a Tuesday at 8 a.m.? And I suppose you take the day off. And I would think to myself, where did this get its start? Do they do this in Ireland, or is this an American thing?
It's a little bit of both. One of my friends in Dublin once said, not entirely joking, that like the worst part of St. Patrick's Day is the day after St. Patrick's Day, because a lot of the drunk people, when they're leaving the bars, are drunk enough that things are coming back up, we'll just say, on the sidewalks.
Sure.
It's very gross and very messy, in her opinion. So that it's definitely something that also happens over there. It's funny though, because in Ireland, it's much more of this, like, it's a very serious Catholic holiday. It's a bank holiday. It's like a big deal over there, more so than here. But I think that drinking kind of grew out of that idea of it's this celebration. And at least over here, I know that that's kind of what we focused on, because we're not a Catholic country. There's not a huge emphasis on you need to go to mass on St. Patrick's Day.
No. Maybe in New York or Chicago,
or
maybe
Boston.
Or Boston. Now, St. Patrick himself today, and I don't want to sound completely naive here, but Americans, and I'm just talking about us, I'm speaking about me, okay? Americans dress up in something green and get drunk.
Yeah.
And that is St. Patrick's Day. And so today, I don't know a lot about it, but today I look up St. Patrick, and sure enough, today, the 17th, he was killed on this day. And he died, or was he killed?
He died.
How did he die?
Old age, as far as I know. I don't think it was anything, violent.
Oh, okay. Maybe I see. That's the problem with getting old. I read it this morning and I forgot it already. Okay, so
getting old beats the alternative.
But it was in like 461.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so who was St. Patrick, and why all of this? What's the correct word? Reverence? What all this admiration for St. Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, so the short answer to the second part of the question is Catholic Church propaganda is kind of why
Okay.
he's
Fair
such a
enough.
big deal.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at too, because Patrick was not originally Irish. He was a Roman citizen in England or Wales, somewhere in that area. Because this would have been around 400. So, quite a while ago. And when he was 16, was kidnapped and brought to Ireland as a slave. And he had come from a Christian home, but he didn't consider himself really Christian himself. But while he was in Ireland, he had this religious experience and, I guess came to Jesus would be the way we would say it today. He eventually escaped and in a roundabout way ended up making his way back to where he'd come from. But he decided that he needed to return to Ireland to preach Christianity there. So he did. He was not the first Christian in Ireland. There were already churches and bishops and stuff. But he felt like this was his mission. He was the first evangelical person really going there. He didn't really accomplish too much during his lifetime. And we know this because there's this letter he wrote called his Confessio, where he talks about his life and all that. He did found a church in Armagh in Northern Ireland, and then he died, as people do. And then about 200 years after he died, they decided to write his hagiography, which is like his saint biography. And the person who wrote it was basically writing it as kind of propaganda for the church he had founded. So his version of Patrick was this sort of miracle working, super powerful guy. And then another 500 years later, in the 13th century, in the 1200s, another guy came around and wrote another saint biography for him on commission for the same church. And he really went all out. He turned Patrick kind of into this like comic book superhero kind of figure. And I'm not even exaggerating when I say that. Like, he talks about Patrick turning himself and his followers into deer, like physical deer, to escape pursuit. He has Patrick like invoking earthquakes and going to Rome and talking to God in a burning bush and resurrecting the dead. I mean, it really is, when you read it, it's like reading a modern like comic book.
It sounds like a Marvel, Marvel character.
Exactly.
So you're saying let's back up. Now I've got my learn. A lot of information. Now. I didn't know any of this. So historically, the records of his life from the time that he was alive had none of this.
Right.
He was just an average guy.
I mean, he was an average guy.
He preached but there were no reports of him, doing.
No. He is not actually officially canonized as a saint through the Catholic Church. They never actually canonized him. It's just people decided he was very significant and a saint, and they I think the church a little while ago had tried to like unsaint him, and there was such an outcry about it. Like, so many people got upset that they were like, okay, you can keep him, even though
this is like the best show ever, and I've done thousands of shows. I am blown away, but I didn't know.
Yeah, no, most people don't. And it's such a severe difference actually between like the historic Patrick and the mythic Patrick that historians and folklorists and etc. differentiate between the two. Like, if you're talking about historic Patrick, you'll say I'm talking about, historic Patrick in Ireland, who's kind of boring. Or if you're talking about mythic Patrick, you'll specify that because the mythic stuff that's come out around him is just so intense, and there's so much of it. That's where we get he banished all the snakes from. That's from that 12th century.
Yeah. So are you? Wait. You're gonna crush me.
I'm
So
sorry.
that never happened? That never happened?
So Ireland has not had snakes since the last ice age. So it's like whatever 11,000 something years. So when you're looking for a convenient miracle
Oh,
to attribute to
okay.
him, and no one's going to argue because there's no snakes, and this is hundreds of years after he died, so obviously nobody remembers that there have never been snakes there at that point. So they just tell people, well, he banished all the snakes, that's why there aren't any, and that makes a lot of sense to them.
Oh my. Okay. All right. We're going to back up again. Here's
Yeah,
the
it's
thing.
It's a lot.
No, we're going to unpack all of this. And I'm not here to crush my Irish brothers and sisters. They probably know all of this stuff already, but they just don't. They keep it on the down low. But let's back up if we may.
Mm-hmm.
We have the convenience of 24-hour news and Wikipedia and the internet, and we can access everything. But if you go back, he died in 461, and 200 years after that, as you said, the first crack at sainthood was written up, right? And so that would have been 660, 670 AD. Nobody can fact check this stuff.
Right.
Right. So you write it up, it's good to go. Right. And that's creating dogma that eventually turns into truth.
Right. And then, when you get to the one 700 years after he died in the 1200s, that's so far from his life that when they're talking about him doing all of this like amazing, exceptional stuff, and at that point, by the 12th century, Ireland was very, very Christian. So for a little bit of context, when the first Super St. Patrick thing came out in the 7th century, there were still pagans, there were still druids, but it was kind of really minimal at that point. It was on the way out. By the 12th century, it's pretty much all Christian. So to have all these extraordinary, like amazing stories about him, it was something people wanted to hear. It's like modern day soap operas or Marvel movies, or it's fabulous. And why wouldn't you believe it? It explains all of these things.
Unbelievable. I just put it in the chat. Super St. Patrick. Now, let's give him a cape. And I don't want to, because it's a great holiday and we all have a lot of fun with it for sure. But to go back and point out 200 years after, and I think you said 700 years after that, to write this up, he was officially made a saint, right? By the church.
I don't believe so. From what I know, he was never officially made a saint. It's just everyone decided he was a saint. He became a saint through like popular proclamation, not officially through the church.
Okay. I am going to Google, is St. Patrick officially a saint?
Yeah, there was actually a whole controversy about this a decade or two ago. The church tried to say that St. Patrick and St. Christopher, who are two very popular saints, were not actually saints. And
wow, no, he is not a saint.
Yeah, surprise.
He's the patron saint of Ireland.
Yes.
But
he's not officially a canonized saint.
Yeah, and the Catholic Church says, well, first off, in the 5th century, there were no saints. So there was no process to make it official in the 5th century.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So that's the church's position. And then we're going to move on. We'll get to all the other stuff here, but you said that the church took another crack at this recently to undo and remove any references to sainthood?
Yes, they tried for St. Patrick and St. Christopher. They tried to basically say these are not saints. They're not officially part of the Catholic saint groups. And there was so much pushback that they ended up backing off of that and kind of letting them remain.
Yeah,
as saints.
Boston must have lost their minds.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm being serious here. So, let's go back to the 700, which you said was 13th century, 1200s.
Yep.
What was, because you have to prove a miracle. What was the miracle that they were trying to use to get him into sainthood?
Well, they definitely look at the banishing the snakes thing. We just know scientifically that wasn't a thing.
We were taught that in school. I mean, it's one of my fondest memories, and this didn't happen. I remember as an adult, Morgan, and you can laugh, it's okay. As an adult, I went and researched snakes in Ireland about, St. Patrick. I thought there's snakes everywhere. And then I found out there's no snakes in Ireland. And I thought, well, I guess that happened. But you're saying there's never been snakes in Ireland. Wow.
Not for like 11,000 years.
Yeah.
No,
I get that.
Yeah.
Wow.
But I mean,
okay.
It makes sense though to attribute that miracle to him because it explains why there's no snakes. Physical.
Now, I mean, okay, let's say he's officially not a saint. Does that matter?
No.
I mean,
Nobody
we've
enjoyed
this for so long. Does anybody care? I don't. I'm
Yeah,
shocked,
no.
but it doesn't
Well,
change.
and that's the thing. Most people think he's a saint. They treat him like a saint. So the fact that he isn't officially one, it doesn't affect most people.
No, wouldn't affect me. Somebody just posted, there's no snakes in Hawaii either.
Huh. That's actually
I wonder about, wonder about Iceland.
As far as I know, they don't, but their climate, I've actually been to Iceland. It's a very cool place. I guess pun intended. Their climate, I don't know how, it like the highs in the summer are like 60, 70.
Yeah, I don't think there's mosquitoes in Iceland or flies. I think both of those are missing too.
Yeah, I definitely never saw any mosquitoes.
But they've got gnomes. They do have gnomes.
They do. And trolls.
And elves. Yeah. All that is real.
Everywhere you look, there's elves in Iceland. It's a very big thing over there.
Now, did St. Patrick have anything to do? I'm sure they've tied it in. Leprechauns and fairies and all that other stuff?
The stories that we have, so this is not the historic Patrick, this is the mythic Patrick. The stories that we have do talk about him like banishing native spirits and preaching against the belief in those sorts of things. So there's actually a prayer from, I believe it's the 5th century. So this would have been right after he died, like shortly after his lifetime, where it talks about how, before Patrick came, before Christianity came, that the people worshipped the fairies, basically, the initiated good folk. And that was part of what the Christians were sort of pushing back against. Clearly very ineffectively, because all of those beliefs are still there today.
Right.
They didn't go anywhere. So we do have stories from those, the mythic super saint stories, of him sort of trying to get rid of these spirits to kick them all out.
Now, I've got a theory about leprechauns. You want to hear it?
Sure.
They're little green men from spaceships.
So it's funny that you say that, because that actually is like one of the biggest arguments between the ufology community and the fairy folklore community. And if you're not familiar with him, Joshua Cutchin has a really great book called, he has Thieves in the Night and then he has Trojan Feast. They're both very good that talk about a lot of this. So the fairy folklore community will tell you that stories of aliens and UFOs are stories of fairies. That people who don't have the context to understand fairies or those beliefs go to science fiction and science and say that it's aliens. The ufology community says exactly the reverse of that. That old stories of fairies, like the stories of leprechauns, and fairy abductions and all of those things are actually UFOs and aliens with people who didn't have that context, who didn't know what
But
those
they didn't have the
were.
word. They didn't have the words to use. And who? Okay, so you've got a little Irish village, right, with thatched roofs, right, and you see some green dudes running around in the forest. You're not thinking aliens.
Right.
So you're going to come home and tell everyone that you just saw some leprechauns. I mean, they don't have the vocabulary to get into that conversation, and it probably wouldn't enter their minds.
Yeah,
I'm
they didn't have
okay
that
with that. Well, see, that's a simpler way of solving the riddle. Number one, but number two, the leprechaun side of it, the Irish leprechaun side of it, is folklore. My version is real. Right? You see the difference of how I'm placing this, and I'm okay with the little green men thing.
Now, I obviously fall on the fairy folklore end of things.
Sure,
that's
sure,
kind of
sure.
my place. But I will say, maybe in support of your theory, that in the older Irish mythology, it does say that the Tuatha De Danann, the Irish gods, came from a ship in the sky and landed on a mountain.
No, it does not. Does it?
Yep. That they brought darkness and mist on the land for 3 days and landed in a ship on top of a mountain.
What?
So take that as you will.
How old is that?
That goes back to, I believe it's the 9th century.
Right.
A lot of these stories were recorded earlier, but the surviving copies we have date to the 9th century.
Holy crap. No, I've never heard that either. This is the best show ever. And I've got some more memorable shows. Ships from the sky that landed on a mountain. Am I understanding?
Yep.
Right? What would they have seen to tell that story?
That's a good question. Like I said, I fall more on the and I should clarify this. When we talk about fairies and folklore, the rational explanation, I don't know how we would explain this, is that these are interdimensional or extra-dimensional beings as opposed to extraterrestrial. That these are beings who live in a dimension that is attached to or next to our reality, and that they can kind of move back and forth as they want to. But yes, the one of the stories of how the Tuatha De Danann arrived in Ireland, which is told in a book called the the Taking of Ireland, Invasions of Ireland, is that they came down in mist and darkness and landed on the mountain. And it's funny actually when you read it, because the scribe writing it, of course, was Christian. So he tells this whole story, which was clearly the older belief that people had, and then he kind of adds, but of course we know that this is not true because Jesus. So it's interesting to dig into that kind of material to see what they have.
Even if you're making up the story, okay, let's go with that. Let's go with this is just a made up story. Where would the reference come from for a ship in the sky?
Yeah.
Nobody has seen an airplane, right? Nobody's got that kind of reference. And so to bring it out of nobody has seen a Steven Spielberg movie. You know what I mean? There's where does that come from? That's very intriguing to me.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. And it's one of those things we'll never know for sure unless, either fairies come out to the human population and tell us, or aliens land and tell us,
Right,
you
right,
know,
right.
unless something happens. Um,
Every culture on this planet has got some kind of origin story like that.
yeah. There's a
It's
lot there's a lot of crossover between alien and UFO stories and fairy folklore. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, because most people, when you think fairies, you think like Tinkerbell, like
Mhm.
tiny little child with wings. And the way they were understood previously, excluding leprechauns, because you're right, those are tiny and kind of a different thing. But the way the fairies, the Thena, the good folk were understood, was that they looked very human, but they weren't. They could appear, they could disappear. They did occasionally steal humans. Sometimes they gave them back. Sometimes they kept them. So
What would
there's a
they do
lot.
if they kept a human? What would they do with them?
So it depends a little, because there's different stories. In a lot of cases, they took them. I'm trying to think of the nicest way to say this, for breeding stock.
Really?
Yeah, there's a lot of stories about that. Sometimes they took them
Wait,
for
wait, wait, wait,
entertainment.
wait. So fairies are full size?
Yes, some of them can be. So when we talk about fairies, it's like this whole range of different beings. It's kind of like if we
Well,
say animal.
let's get into that a little bit. First off, I mean, for transparency, and I know what I look like and who I am. Okay, I understand that. I have an image, but I don't give a shit. Fairies are real. Okay, so I'm just going to say that. Now, I had a fairy experience.
Oh, cool.
And at the time, I'm not going to get into the whole story. You're the guest on the show, but I'll say this. Um, I'm having a conference at this facility, a Fade to Black conference, and we've got, I don't know, 300 people there. And so I'm there for the opening ceremonies, and we do this orientation. And the manager of this center is speaking to everybody. And she says, okay, I just want to let everybody know that we have fairies here. And she says that, and I go, just like that. I swear on all that I love, I go just like this. Bullshit. Just like, I mean, just like, don't, no, right? Well, that was my mistake. All right. And so that night and the next day, I had an interaction and my view changed. And I don't care. I don't care what people say to me. Fairies are real.
I firmly
Yeah.
believe that a lot of people have fairy experiences, but not a lot of people are comfortable talking about it for that sort of reason, that there's this assumption people are going to judge you and, make fun of you. Like this
Right,
country is
right.
so interesting to me, because we can talk about ghosts, and even people who don't believe in ghosts, if you're saying I had a ghost experience, they'll listen. They might be skeptical, but they're like, okay. We can even talk about aliens. Again, people might not believe you, but it's like, okay. But as soon as you say fairies, people immediately are like, oh, that's
Yeah. No,
Morgan.
Morgan, you're so right.
Yeah.
People will put crystals on their body and activate chakras and kundalini, this and that, but you can't talk about fairies. It's like,
Yeah.
wait. You believe Christ teleported, but you don't believe in fairies,
Yeah.
right? It's like you can't have it both ways, can you? Now, you mentioned, let's back up. I don't want this to get away from me. I'm in learning mode. You said that there are many different species of fairies. Take
Yeah.
us through that. Who are they? What are they?
So you mentioned leprechauns. That would be something that would kind of fall in this general topic. those, of course, like 18 inches tall, fairly small. They can be very tricky. So I can kind of see where people would make the alien connection with leprechauns just from the stories. You have in Ireland, they would be called Thinashee, the people of the fairy hills, the people of the Shee. In Scotland, they're also called something similar, but they get labeled as well elves. So if you think of them more like what you would think of like Tolkien's elves, but without the pointed ears. Mm-hmm. Do you have a similar thing in Iceland like that? Then you have kind of the little winged beings that people do see. Sylph would be the older name for that. People just call them fairies now. You have fairy hounds, which are like fairy dogs. Fairy horses, which are not something you ever want to encounter because they tend to eat people. And not all fairies are nice. Some of them you definitely want to stay away from.
I remember in the movie Labyrinth, when they were first entering, and Jennifer Connelly, she goes, "Oh, a fairy," and she picks it up and it bites her. She goes, "Ow, it bit me." And he goes, "What do you think fairies do?" What was his name? Hogart?
Hoggle,
Hoggle.
yeah.
What do you think fairies do?
Yep. That is actually one of my favorite quotes. I repeat that to people a lot because just because it looks cute and tiny does not mean it's not gonna mess with you.
I had this lady come up to me, and now everything that I'm about to say is true. So open your mind. This lady comes up to me. I'm sitting there, and we're at that conference I was telling you about. And so I'm sitting there behaving, drinking coffee. It's in the morning. She comes up to me and she goes, "Jimmy, I just took a picture of a fairy." I'm like, "Man, no. You want to see it?" Oh, God. All right. She shows it to me. And it's just like you were saying. It was Tinkerbell. Mm-hmm. I don't know how big, excuse me. I don't know how big it was, but I'm guessing that in the picture it was probably about this big. And there was a bubble, like a bubble, clear, like glass. And the fairy is in the middle of, and female, like standing like this with her legs down with wings, right? Yep. Okay. Inside the bubble. I'm looking at it. I go, "Where'd you take this?" She goes, "Right there next to that tree." And I see the tree in the picture, right? I see it. So you know what I did for the next 2 days? I walked around that stupid tree with my cell phone. Oh. Yeah. I didn't see any fairies.
I probably would have done the same thing.
Yeah. Have you ever heard about anything like that in a bubble?
So I was talking to someone a couple years ago who had an experience where she'd been out like on her property and it was dark. And I will preface this by saying somewhere they don't have fireflies or lightning bugs, anything like that. And she was looking at this tree in like the twilight. It was getting dark, but it wasn't like pitch black yet. And all of a sudden she saw all of these lights. And she got a little closer and described them as it was like little glowing fairies, basically.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah. So I'll tell you a funny story. I think it's funny. You might not think it's funny. So I was kind of raised with this belief in fairies. It's an Irish American thing. It's an Irish thing, sort of where I get it from. But I was always kind of obnoxious about the little Tinkerbell ones. I was like, those aren't real. Like fairies are real, but that's not what they look like. That's just Victorian propaganda. Like I admit I was really obnoxious about it. And then one time, maybe 20 years ago, I was with two of my friends and one of them owned a store. So we're in the city. The store had just closed, but it was summer. So we still had the door open. It's like 9:00 at night. We're just hanging out talking because we were in our early 20s. And all of a sudden, all three of us saw this, by the way. All of a sudden, this fairly large, looked at first like a giant white moth, but like big, like if you put your hands together, like that size, maybe a little bigger, flew in the door and then just hovered like right above the door. And my one friend who owned the store, she just saw it the whole time as like this gigantic white moth. The other friend and I, though, we saw it as a little man with wings. And we were both just kind of staring at it. And then it flew over more towards where she had like a display in a big window. And the other friend who saw it as a little winged man, he points at it and he just goes really loudly like, "You." And it immediately dropped straight down and disappeared. And all three of us went over and looked. There was nowhere it could have gone. It was very large. It just was gone. And one of the weirdest experiences I've ever had, I've had a lot of weird experiences, but that's up there. And it really kind of opened my eyes to like, it's okay to be skeptical of things, but you need to keep an open mind. You know, all that time I was like, oh no, little winged fairies don't exist. That's not a real thing. And then I had that experience and I was like, okay, I need to not be so critical of other people's experiences. You know, because you never know what you're going to end up experiencing yourself.
The interdimensional part of this is again, to repeat everything that we've been talking about, is something that has been part of religion and folklore and mythology forever. Ghost, angels, whatever you want to, whatever label. Today, with science and 11 dimensions and string theory and the multiverse and entanglement and parallel worlds and timelines, all of these conversations that they have in physics today would suggest that it's not folklore, that these supernatural aspects to religion and mythology and our past in the historical text may be rooted and have a foundation in science.
Yeah. I think that, you know, we tend to get this idea that if science hasn't already proven it, if we don't already have a theory for it, if we don't already have some kind of hard evidence for it, then it must not be real or it must not be true. And so people get very skeptical about a lot of things. But I think we forget that like science is discovering new things every day. You know, a lot of the stuff that we kind of accept now, 100, 200 years ago, no one would have believed it. You know, if you were describing an airplane to someone, not that that's exactly science, but if you were describing an airplane to someone 200, 300 years ago, they would think it was ridiculous. You were just, you know, fanciful stories because obviously that's not possible. And now we know it is, and we understand the science behind how you get the airplane up and keep it in the air. The same thing with, you know, they'll talk about certain animals and people will be like, oh, that's not real until you actually find one. Or animals that are supposed to be extinct for 100 years and then they find one alive somewhere. I think there's a lot more out there than we can necessarily scientifically prove now. But every day the technology expands, and I wouldn't be surprised in another 100 years, 200 years if we proved that ghosts were real. If we had like real scientific solid evidence that they did exist. If we, you know, could prove, well, I guess not so much aliens. Aliens will prove themselves if they're really out there. But things like fairies, interdimensional beings, all of this stuff that we right now, you know, are skeptical about because science hasn't caught up. But I think we'll get there.
The idea of an airplane being described to somebody 200 or 300 years ago, I think that's a really, really good way to put it and to frame it that way. The Irish talked about it as their origin story. That's
fair.
That's right back to my point.
Yeah.
You know, what was it that they saw in the sky? The interdimensional part of it, uh, I think possibly that everything is going to come down to some pretty fundamental, simple aspects.
Mhm.
And once, I don't think it's going to be in 100 years. I think it's going to be like next week if we keep doing what we're doing. But
Yeah.
that being said, whatever it is that people want to put up to a vibrant imagination, that, and that goes into any aspect of something that appears and then disappears, that science is going to show us very clearly that this is going on. Suddenly, ghosts, Bigfoot, ET, fairies, gnomes, leprechauns, the gods of from Greece, right? Everything now can come down to one simple explanation. And then it just goes back to say, well, I guess everybody wasn't crazy then.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up Bigfoot. Not that that's my main focus, but that's a fascinating example of something where you find people believing in it across these huge geographic areas. You know, they have stories in China, you have them all over the US. It always makes me wonder, like, if it's not real, if there's not something there that people are talking about and seeing and experiencing, why do we have so many stories all over the place about this same kind of thing, even with cultures that didn't really interact with each other, you know, for a long time? It just seems to me like there has to be something more to it. You know, the same thing with ghosts. Pretty much every culture has a concept of ghosts.
Everyone.
You know, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yep. Ghosts have been written about for thousands of years.
mhm.
Thousands. And really good ghost stories, you know, 1500, 2000 years. I mean, just as good as any ghost story you've got today. So obviously, there was a point of reference, you
Yeah,
know, and I don't know what people are seeing. I don't know, but we've always got to remember, what kind of vocabulary did they have?
right.
What kind of words did they have at their disposal to describe these events that went on, that they turn around and, you know, wrote about it? I
Yeah,
don't know, but it's the same thing that we talk about today.
yeah, yeah. And that's just like you were saying before. That's the fairy alien argument. Both sides of it really, what they're saying is, what was the context for the person who had this experience? You know, did they say it was fairies because they've heard stories of fairies and that's their context? Or did they say it was aliens because they're familiar with the idea of aliens and that was the context they fit it into? Are we just using different words for the same things,
Yeah,
basically?
exactly. Now, why is it? Now, I understand Italy and I understand Norway and Egypt and Mesopotamia and even Japan and China and Russia. Everybody has got their stories. They do. But for some reason, England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, right? The United Kingdom, they've got more magic and mythological creatures and cryptozoology, right? Probably more there on that little group of islands and countries than the rest of the planet. Why is that? And throw in Merlin, right?
Yeah. I think for myself, I think we find stories of fairy-like beings, because obviously they're not going to call them fairies in Japan or Korea or Africa or wherever. I do think we find them globally. I think you're right that, like, when most people think of it, they think of Ireland, and then Scotland and Wales and England have kind of popularized it. And I think some of that is that when you go to those places, people have stories, people have experiences. It's not just that you're sharing a story that we're told that happened a long time ago, like a legend. You're sharing stories of like, oh, my neighbor had this happen, or my grandfather. It's more direct. It's more personal, a lot of them. And there's something in Irish fairy beliefs and English fairy beliefs and so on that I think just really resonates with people. It reaches something inside of us that we feel connected to it.
I just wanted to say really quick in the interest of public service. There was just an earthquake in San Francisco, in that area. A few people that are up there right now that are listening to the show have let us know that they've just had an earthquake. I will look into it, and if I've got anything to report back, this is a live show. I will do that, but I hope everybody is safe up there. And I'm hoping it's a little shaker. Don't know. I don't have any more information than that, but it just happened about 1 minute ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you know what? I got to tell you, Morgan, I've been doing live radio at different levels, the biggest and everything else, for a very long time. And it just seems that I had to get very used to doing breaking news like this. You have to. And one of the reasons for that, and it's a simple one, very simple reason. People are here listening to an interview and a conversation between a couple of people. They're not watching. They're not, they're tuned into us. And if something and things happen all the time, and I would have to break in and report it. You just don't know. It may be in somebody's neighborhood, and they're sitting there listening to me talk about, aliens and life after death and fairies, and focused when something could be going on out there. So once in a while, I do have to break in with that.
Definitely. Everyone stay safe out there. Be safe.
Yeah, Julie just said I was sitting in my living room. Everything started shaking. 4.2 on the Richter scale. Yeah, 4.0. Just had an earthquake.
You never know what's going to happen.
So anyway, again, if I get some other news and updates, 4.0, I can relax here. Earthquake in San Francisco.
I'd heard there was one in Malibu or around Malibu yesterday or this morning.
And there was one a couple of days ago too as well. My friends were talking about it. That happened right in downtown Burbank, right?
Okay.
And Valley Village. And I was talking to my friend, talking to a friend on the phone. When it happened, I didn't feel anything.
Yeah.
I'm like 30 miles away from there, but nothing here. And he was like, dude, no, man, it was big. How could you not feel it? Well, it's because it was like literally underneath his house. But
we don't. I live on the East Coast. We don't get earthquakes often, but we've had a couple very tiny ones in my lifetime, and I can only imagine what the bigger ones must be like.
Yeah, magnitude 4.2, 22 miles from Willits. Wow. Okay, I lived in Willits. Willits is this big, little tiny town. I don't know, 2,000 people, little town in the middle of the redwoods there. But yeah, I know exactly where this was. Wow, Willits. Okay, my dad lives up there in Willits. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna have to check in on him. So
hopefully everyone's okay.
Well, it just like with anything, a 4.0 doesn't sound very big, but if it's close to the surface, that's real. If it's a 4.0 and it's 30 miles down, well, okay. But the closer to the surface, the more that you feel it. Oh, Willits was this morning. Oh, it was in Dublin, California.
On theme for our show.
Yeah. How funny is that? Okay. So anyway, moving on back to what we were talking about is magic in the United Kingdom. I mean, it just seems that so much of that belief system and part of the historical side of it comes out of the UK. You don't hear much about magic or elemental stuff outside of the UK. You get taste of it, but nothing like the United Kingdom.
Yeah, there's definitely, particularly in England, you have a lot of different variations of magical practice. You have, like cunning folk, which would be the people out like working for their neighbors, helping people with healing stuff and spirit stuff and fairy stuff. You have the more like ceremonial magic kind of stuff, which is the fancy circles and the frankincense and expensive equipment. You have folk magic connected to like Christianity, where people pray to saints. Or one thing you see a lot, not so much in the UK, but in Ireland, is people going to healing wells for specific things. And you might, like one practice is you would tear a bit of cloth off what you were wearing and then tie it to the well. And the idea is that as the cloth kind of degrades and falls apart, whatever you need healed will be healed. So yeah, there's all kinds of different magical practices and approaches kind of all across that area, that Western European area.
I'm so fascinated with this. And is there specifically Ireland? Now, I don't know about Dublin or the big cities, but as you get out into the countryside, how strong is the belief in witches and magic and fairies and everything else that we're talking about, where it is part of the fabric of life?
So it's pretty funny. And this is true for Iceland and Ireland both, because they both have a very big belief in these things today. But if you ask someone, if you just randomly grab a person, over anywhere in Ireland, and you say, do you believe in fairies? They're probably going to say no. But they're going to say no, but they don't do anything that would offend them. Like, better safe than sorry. They're mostly not going to say, yes, of course, I believe in this, but they're going to say, well, I don't, but I'm not going to go to this particular location that's connected to them. Or there's a lot of fairy trees that are associated with them. I'm not going to do anything to that fairy tree. I wouldn't cut it down. I wouldn't do anything to it. Better safe than sorry. And once you actually get people talking, then they're more willing to say, well, actually, I know that they're there and I've had experiences myself. But initially people tend to be very like, well, I don't believe in it, but I wouldn't take the chance either. And I think that gets back to what we were saying a little while ago, a few minutes ago, about how there is this kind of stigma when it comes to fairies, where if you say you believe in them, people immediately think it's a joke, or they'll laugh or whatever. Once they kind of know that you're not going to be that way, that you're going to listen and believe what they say, a lot more willing to talk about it. So,
man, what a great conversation. We're going to pick things up when we come back after this short break. Our guest tonight, Morgan Daimler. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. And we will be right back after this short break. Stay with us. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to get your alerts and access to over 2,000 videos. Click that subscribe button right now. Go to jimmychurchradio.com and get the Fade to Black official podcast. 2,000 episodes, all of them commercial free for just $2 a month. Watch Into the Vortex on Gaia TV. It's Fade to Black for the screen. Simple to do. Go to Gaia.com, search Jimmy Church, or click on the link below. Follow Fade to Black on Twitter at JChurchRadio. Get all of the show updates every single day. It's now called X, but who cares? How you doing? Jimmy Church here. Special announcement. Get your Fade to Black t-shirts. That's right. Help support the show. Help support everything that we do over here. We've got 2 t-shirts. We've got 2 ways to get them. Get your Fade to Black t-shirt today. Go Backley Tappy. Go to jimmychurchradio.com and become a Fadernaut. Get a membership. That's right. Everything is commercial free. You have access to downloads, and you get to call yourself a Fadernaut. Today we're headed to Bolivia, Tiwanaku, Peru, and of course, Pumapunku. Brian, exciting. Thank you so much for everything, my friend.
Always an honor. Right behind us is the sacred river of the Inca that goes past Machu Picchu. So we're going to be driving up to its source at 15,000 feet above sea level and then down to Lake Titicaca.
So today we hit 15,000 feet.
Yes.
Crazy. And you can do it with us. All you have to do is go to hiddenincatours.com. Simple. We've got 2 tours coming up next year, one in June for the summer solstice, right? And then another one right here in November. So hiddenincatours.com. Come and hang out with Brian and I and his amazing team.
Right on.
River Moon Coffee, makers of the Fade to Black blend. Truly the best coffee on planet Earth. Just visit rivermoonwellness.com or their Amazon store. It's all simple to do. You can check out the Fade to Black blend, the Game Changer blend, or any of their Black Moon Wellness products. It's the only coffee I drink. It is the best, and it's Doc. Again, rivermoonwellness.com. All right. Welcome back, Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. Tonight is our annual, we do it every year, our annual St. Patrick's Day special. And our guest tonight, Morgan Daimler, is with us. And what have I learned tonight? Well, St. Patrick isn't an actual saint. I'm heartbroken. Ireland has never had snakes, and I'm just going to leave that right there. Doesn't change it for me. No, I'm still cool with St. Patrick's Day. And we were talking about fairies before the break. Morgan, what is the checklist? Okay, before we get into that, this is my belief system. If you are constantly losing your keys and you can't find them, just ask the fairies to return them.
Yep.
That's my take. Is that official?
Yeah, probably one of the most common things people will talk about is that sort of fairy. They just seem to get really amused by watching humans run around desperately trying to find a missing item, usually car keys. For people who haven't experienced this, you would literally like put your car keys down on a counter, walk away, come back at some later point, keys are gone. You search everywhere, and then, like you had just said, ask for them back. I know some people will bribe them because they like dairy products, give them a little butter, a little cream, and then your
Oh,
keys are
really?
going to show up exactly where you left them. Yeah.
Really? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I put my keys in the exact same spot on the
Yep.
shelf. And
I've had
now,
some.
what's that?
I was gonna say I've had some weird experiences myself. Not just with keys. I had a ring that I took off and put on a shelf.
I got a ring story. I got a fairy ring story. Okay, let me hear yours first.
I had a ring and I took it off and put it on a shelf, and I knew exactly where I put it. Not a problem. I went the next day to pick it up to put it back on. It was gone. I looked for this ring for weeks and weeks. Could not find it. I never thought to ask for the fairies to get back because I just assumed it must have gotten knocked off the shelf. I had cats, it was just gone. And then months went by. I was in my car, and I keep spare change in like the ashtray in the car. I have an old car. Just for everyone who's wondering about cars that still have ashtrays. I don't think they do anymore, but this is an old one. And I went to get like some spare change out for something, and there was my ring. And there's absolutely no way it could have ended up there. Like
I know.
it made no sense.
Nobody's questioning you.
Fairies.
All right, I have a very similar story. Very similar. I guess fairies like rings. So I don't have any rings on right now, but anybody that hangs out with me in public, they know I wear a ring on every finger. Okay. And I'm very picky. I've got lots of rings, and everything has got their own little spot that they go on. And I had this ring on my ring finger on my right hand that was hard to get off. And so at night, I don't want to get into the long version of this, but taking off the rings is, I always get to that one and, you know what I mean, have to work to get it off. And so I'm sitting at this conference with Jason Quitt. He's next to me. We're in the back. I just introduced somebody on stage, and I walked to the back of the room and sat in the last row with Jason watching this presentation. And I fall asleep. Okay? I do fall asleep. I wake up and go back on stage. I do my thing. The whole day goes by. I go back to my hotel room that night. It's like midnight, and I'm taking off my rings. What? It's gone. And I did what you did. I look all over the floor. I look here, there, go back in the bathroom, go out to the car. I search I don't find it.
Yep.
And I'm pretty upset about it. The next morning, I wake up and I look everywhere. I backtrack. I don't have it. And I walk back into my hotel room. I go, man, I can't believe I'm going to do this. But she said, if we lose something, just ask for it back. So I do. Okay, fairies. Out loud too, right?
Yeah.
Okay, fairies, can I please have my ring back? I really liked it. Okay, can I please have my ring back? I get in my car. I drive back to the event. It's 2 minutes away. I park my car. I get out. It's like 8 o'clock in the morning, 8:30. And I'm walking up to the conference, and I'm going to introduce and start the day at 9 o'clock. And the event organizer comes up, and she's got her clipboard, and she goes, Jimmy, blah, 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 blah. I said, yeah, I got this. I got this. And then while I'm talking to her, this lady comes up. She goes, Jimmy, did you lose a ring? I did. Is it this one? What? She goes, a lady found this on the floor in the back of the room in the chair you were sitting in yesterday. What?
Mhm.
So that ring fell off of my finger while I was sitting in that chair. Now, somebody explain that to me. Now, so I'm picturing 3 or 4 fairies hanging on my finger, right? Pulling
Yeah.
this thing down. And I was blown away. Now, it was 2 minutes after I asked for it back. 2 minutes.
Yep.
2 minutes. Somebody can explain it away all they want. I'm just telling you how it went down.
Yeah.
And, and it's part of the reason why I'm just comfortable saying fairies are real.
Yeah. I'll tell you one more ring story because you actually reminded me of one I'd forgotten about. I'm not married now, but I was. And I was at that same friend's store that we saw the winged, whatever it was. And we were talking and I looked down and my wedding ring was gone. Just not on my hand. And the same situation, it was not loose enough to come off. I have kind of chubby fingers, so you have to,
Right.
work to get rings on and off. So I knew it hadn't just fallen off and I got really freaked out because I did not want to explain to my husband why I didn't have my wedding ring.
No, you're in a bad spot for sure.
Yeah. We looked all around. We couldn't find it. I eventually left and went home. And then it wasn't that day. I think it was a few days later. Because again, I never think in the moment, despite the fact that this is like a big part of my everything. I never think in the moment, this is fairies. I need to ask them to give it back.
Right.
I always tell other people that, but I never think to do it myself.
Of course.
And my friend called me like 2 or 3 days later. She had found it in the back room of her store, sitting on its side. So it was like upright, like a circle on the ground. And she was the one that was like, this is fairies. And I was like, it sounds like it was fairies, to be honest, because it got taken off of my hand and then showed up in a place I had not been. Like I had not been back there. And it was such a weird, everything about it was just very weird. So I fully believe your story.
Well, see, the part of me that was reticent about telling that story on the air. And I thought to myself, if you don't share the story, you're kind of lying to people, right? Just go ahead and tell the story. Tell it like it happened. My belief is fairies took the ring and returned it. That's my belief. But listen to the story and then think about the events in your own life. Has there been anything similar? There's that. 2, the people that have experienced this kind of stuff need to hear it from other people. They do.
Yeah,
and there's
that's
nothing wrong.
Honestly, that's the biggest reason that I do talk so publicly about this and about the fact that I have had my own experiences. Because I know that I'm not the only one out there, but I also know how good it feels when someone else says, I've also had that happen. Or I had something not the same, but kind of similar. And then you feel less just alone in it. You know?
And don't be a dick to the fairies. Don't be a dick about it. You'll never get it back.
Yes.
I Morgan, I tapped out. I did. I tapped out. Fairies, okay, man. All right, okay. Can I please have my ring back? I did, and it was heartfelt too. It was real.
I'll tell you one other story.
Yeah, let's go.
Because I'm not gonna spend the whole show just telling stories.
Oh no, please! Stories are great.
But this is a story where it was happened to a group of us, but we did have the common sense to acknowledge it was the fairies, which is kind of what got us out of it. So there's this phenomenon that happens. It's called being pixie led, or fairy led, where you get lost in familiar territory.
Yep.
Basically, there's no reason you should be lost. You know where you are, but you just cannot physically get out of it, or you can't find your way. So this was probably 26 or 27 years ago. I was hanging out with a group of probably 8 or 9 people. And one of the people in the group had mentioned where she had grown up. If you went hiked back in the woods, there was this really cool rock and it was a full moon. So we decided we'll go to her house. This is what you do in your late teens and early 20s in a small town. And we'll hike out to this cool rock and sit there in the full moon and have an experience. And we did, and that part was fine. Getting back, however, we're hiking through the woods. It's not far. It's maybe a quarter of a mile, half a mile in the woods. Like, it's not far at all. We can see the lights from the houses because this is the suburbs and then like a little reservoir area. Could see the lights from the houses. No matter how much we walked towards the lights, we could not get any closer. And this went on. It took us maybe 10, 15 minutes to walk out. It took us half an hour walking back before we were like, okay, something's not right here. Because it's not physically possible for us to have walked this long towards these lights and not have gotten to somewhere. The area's just not that big. And a couple of the other people in the group started getting really upset. It's dark. No one knows what's going on. We're lost where we shouldn't be lost. We cannot get out of the woods. And they were getting upset. And my friend and I, the same one that I had the flying man experience with, the one who had said you and then it fell, that same friend, he starts laughing. And then I start laughing. And then the two of us are both like, oh, what a great joke. The fairies are playing on us. This is so funny. We're having so much fun. And as soon as we said that, it was like you could feel the energy change. And within 2 or 3 minutes, we were out of the woods and on the street. But it was like as soon as we acknowledged what was happening and said that we were enjoying it, they were like, nope, no more.
The other day, I'll share this. I talked about this last week because it just happened and it was strange. I have, it's not OCD really, but I have habits and I just do them. Right. And everything in my house is in its place. And so, and my habits are, I always have 10 rolls of paper towels. I've got 6 rolls of toilet paper in every bathroom. I've got 3 boxes of Kleenex in the cabinets in every bathroom, right? And you go into my bathroom, I have a row of deodorants ready to go. I have extra shampoo and cream. But I just have, so when I run out of something, I don't run to the store. I open up a cabinet. Okay. Now, deodorant on my bathroom counter. It sits in the same exact spot every single day. Mm-hmm. When I run out of the deodorant, into the trash can, I open up the cabinet, take out another one, and replace it. It's a habit. Okay. And I don't break that habit. It's a habit. I don't think it's some deep psychosis or some OCD. I just like stuff that way. Okay. So last week, I get out of the shower, dry off, and walk up to put on my deodorant. And it's not there. I stood and stared at that blank spot on my bathroom counter for a couple of minutes going, WTF? Because I always replace it. Mm-hmm. And it was gone. And so I stood there and I went, when did I run out? What? That had to have been yesterday. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, why didn't I? So, what do I think? I went, okay, it's a ghost. It's a fairy, you know. And I walk over and I look, and there it is in my trash can.
Hmm.
I don't remember doing it. In fact, I don't think I did it. So I go back around, open up the cabinet, take out the deodorant, new one, peel it, throw it in the thing, placed it down on the counter, and went, that was strange. I go about my day. But yeah, yeah, yeah. It messed with me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that sounds like it. Sometimes I think it just entertains them. You
Now
know.
I wanted to ask you, what's the checklist to see if you have a fairy?
So there is some overlap between fairies and ghosts. Like some of the stuff you might look for would apply to both, like electronics draining, batteries draining. That's kind of phenomena that people associate with ghosts. It also happens with fairies. So stuff like that, you kind of have to narrow it down a little further. But a lot of times with fairies, the things that people will mention is hearing music when there shouldn't be any. There's no logical source for it. And particularly music that just doesn't sound right. Like it doesn't sound like anything you would hear. Sometimes chimes or bells where there shouldn't be any. Occasionally voices. And that's another thing. So, there's some crossover with ghosts there, but in my experience, at least with ghosts with voices, people usually record them, like they'll catch them on recording devices. With fairies, you'll hear them. You'll hear them just like it's someone in the next room normally talking. So that's a thing. Fairies can also physically interact with people. And this is where I have a little bit of a disagreement with some of the ghost hunters out there, paranormal researchers out there, because I don't think ghosts are really that physical. This is my belief. Fairies, however, are. So things like getting shoved, like hard enough to really move you, is often more of a fairy thing. It's a little tricky because they can be invisible around people. Like they might be there, but you won't see them. Catching movement in the corner of your eye, and you turn and there's nothing there. A lot of people describe that with fairy experiences. If you do see one, they tend to look very physically real. Like they look like they're actually there. You can't see through them. They're not partially formed. Like it looks like whatever it is there. So those are a lot of the main things that I tell people to kind of look for if these things are happening. Things physically disappearing, which we already talked about a little bit. Ghosts can move things, but if the object is actually gone, like there is nowhere, that is usually fairies, and they like to do that. They like to mess with us, move stuff around in ways that's beyond just like sliding it across a table or off a table, that sort of thing.
Now, you mentioned bells.
Mm-hmm.
Are those bells that they bring with them?
Yeah.
Chimes?
Yep. Bells and chimes. In a lot of the older stories, because fairies are still often, even today, people will describe seeing them like on horseback, riding on horses with dogs, things like that. Like you would expect if it was, 300 or 400 years ago, they still will do that. So a lot of people say the bells are on the horses on the bridles and the saddles and stuff. But it's something a lot of people have mentioned experiencing when there's fairies around. Many types of fairies. You'll hear that. And it doesn't sound like, it's hard to describe, obviously, but it doesn't sound like if you picked up a bell and just started ringing it. It's got like a weird lightness to it. Very high tone, very kind of almost sweet sounding, if I can use that
And
term
you're
for a
messing
bell.
with me. I'm gonna hear them now. You
If
know,
they're
not
around
well.
you, you might.
Yeah. Wow. Do they have a language? You know, you brought up Tolkien earlier, and you know the Elven tongue and things. Do fairies have their own language?
According to some folklore, yes. So, for example, there's a very old uh, book on fairies. It's actually one of the oldest in Scotland. It was written in 1691 by a minister, a very open-minded minister. I'll just put that out there. He was a seventh son, and there was a belief if you were a seventh son, you would have this connection to these spirits, ability to see them, things like that. I think that's where his interest started, but he wrote down a lot of the local Scottish beliefs about these beings, elves, fairies. And he said that they do have their own language, that it doesn't sound like any human language, that it's not something humans can necessarily understand, but it sounds very different. And other sources since then have mentioned it, although we also find in places where like Ireland, there's Irish language and then there's English. You'll hear people saying, well, the fairies speak Irish, but they're not going to speak English necessarily. I don't think Irish is their actual language, but it's kind of associated with them there. But I do think that from the sources we have, it seems like they have some kind of language of their own, but they usually also know the local human language.
Now, when you say Irish language, are you talking about Gaelic?
Um, it's Gaelic is kind of an older term for it. Yeah. Gaeilge would be the term in Irish. But yeah, so we can go with
Yeah,
Gaelic.
it's a Celtic language, right?
Yep. It's one of the 6 modern Celtic languages. So you have Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Manx, Cornish, and Brittonic.
No, you just said Celtic. Is it Celtic or Celtic?
Celtic.
See,
Everyone
that's
says it wrong because of the basketball team.
yeah. So don't shoot me because I hear it pronounced correctly all the time, and I know the correct version of it. But that friggin' basketball team has messed up most of the country when it comes to that.
Yes. The majority of people that I run into that aren't familiar, with the languages, will say Celtic. So very, very common.
So if you have fairies in your house and you're encountering them and you hear them talk, they're not going to be speaking in the Queen's English. They're probably going to be speaking in Gaelic or Celtic.
Or something.
So those would be the voices that you would hear. Wow.
Yeah, if you're hearing voices and you're not sure what language they're speaking, definitely more likely fairies than ghosts, I think.
Wow, that is fascinating to me. Now, what about if we look at, we brought up Iceland and elves and gnomes there. How do the Irish people, especially if we go back in history, but even to today, we have Greek gods, we have Egyptian gods, we have Sumerian gods, we have Christian gods. Is that the way Ireland looks at fairies and leprechauns and elves and gnomes?
That is a fun and complicated question. So you basically have 2 layers, I guess we'll say. The belief is that the two-headed Danann, the old Irish gods, came to Ireland and for a while kind of controlled everything. And then humans came. And when humans came, the Irish gods retreated into the She. She is just a word. It means like fairy mounds, fairy hills, otherworldly mounds. And there were already people there, Aishi, the people of the fairy hills. And then the gods kind of went in and joined them and also became the Aishi. And the Aishi are normally understood as fairies in English. Usually the Tuatha Danann and the Old Irish gods are seen as like kings and queens of fairy, kings and queens of these different locations, these otherworldly mounds. But then you also have these other beings that were not originally understood as gods, but are kind of understood as a different type of spirit. So like leprechauns are sort of their own thing. They have their own king and queen. They have a whole society. I was actually, someone earlier was talking about watching Darby O'Gill and the Little People today in honor of St. Patrick's Day. But that's actually not it's a very corny movie for what it is, but it's not a bad description of how leprechauns are. Like there's a king, there's a whole society, there's a bunch of them. That is kind of what we find in the older stories. So you have the gods as this kind of top layer, and then you have these other types of fairies, these other types of Aishi as another layer. Does that make sense?
Well, if I'm following you, okay, so, but okay, the gods went to the hills where the fairies were because the humans came,
Yeah.
and kind of drove them out, and then the gods became the kings and queens of the fairies, but they
Yes.
weren't fairies before they got there,
Yes.
right? Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah. You're understanding me correctly. Yeah. So
But what were the gods called? Did they have names?
well, Tuatha Danann was the name for the group, the gods as a group. And that just means, well, I shouldn't say that just means, because there's actually a lot of debate about what it means, but most people will say that it means people of the goddess Danu, who's supposed to be like the mother goddess of the pantheon. I guess it's a little bit debated, but that's the most common answer. But then in that, we have all these named beings. So like the Dagda is one. Dagda means good god in Old Irish. And he was kind of at one point the king of all the gods. He is a king of the fairies. You have Brigid, Brige. A lot of people believe she became Saint Brigid. Everything is controversial that I'm saying right now. But that's another thing people will say, that Saint Brigid was originally the goddess, and then she kind of got turned into a saint because she was so popular. People didn't want to stop worshiping her, acknowledging her.
I was going to ask you about this earlier. We're touching upon it now. So just a more direct and for clarification, where do the fairies live in a community? You know, you always hear the fairy folk, right? The fairy
Yes.
folk, you know. So I picture them, you know, I don't know, in a cave or something. Maybe that's too Tolkienish, or living in trees. But they have a community. Where do they live?
Yep. So there's kind of, much like there's the two layers with them, there's two groups. So you have what are called trooping fairies. These are the social ones. These have kings and queens and knights and musicians and ladies and farmers and just everything you would imagine. And then you have the solitary fairies. So the solitary fairies are the ones who just kind of live on their own and do their own thing, and are not necessarily part of like a bigger group or a bigger community. And you kind of have both of those happening at the same time. Different types of fairies might be one or the other. It's sort of a classic way to divide them up is either trooping or solitary. Where they live, this is where we get back into that sort of interdimensional, extra-dimensional idea. There's this concept that they have their own world. It's called the otherworld. It's called the land of fairy, fairyland. In Scotland, they call it Elfheim. We don't really know for sure what it is, just that it is something that is adjacent to our world and they can kind of move back and forth. Time runs differently there compared to here. So we have a lot of stories of people who like either wander into fairy or get taken into it. And then by the time they come back, it's 20 years later, 100 years later. It doesn't usually work out well for the human in the equation. This world, this reality can exist in magical islands. So we have stories about that. One story, there's this magical island. It only appears one day a year. I actually think that's the idea where Brigadoon, for anyone familiar with the musical Brigadoon, where that kind of came from. This idea it's only there one day of the year. We also have fairy trees, the idea that they can go sort of in and out through the tree. We have the Shi, which are these hills or mounds that, again, are sort of associated with this ability to pass into the other world. In Iceland, they have these places, they're called Alfakirkja, which means elf churches, and they're big boulders, big rocks. And it's the same idea that they can pass into that and like through it like it's a doorway, and then into a whole other reality, a whole other world. So, for example, like we would just see a rock. We can't walk through the rock, obviously, but they could walk into it and then they would emerge in another realm, another place. So, yeah, it's kind of everywhere, but not accessible to us, I guess is the easiest way to explain it. Under very, very particular circumstances, we have stories of people who accidentally end up there. Like if it's a really misty day, maybe don't go wandering off because you might end up in fairy. That happens in some Welsh stories. But usually we can't access it. It's not a place.
So again, I don't want to sound naive, but are fairies immortal? Do they die?
As far as we're aware, as far as all the stories say, and particularly the Irish stories, they kind of emphasize there's no age, there's no sickness, none of that exists in their world. They can be killed. So we do have stories of them like dying through violence, but they don't age or get sick. We do have one account from England of someone witnessing a fairy funeral, but he even said when he was recording it that he thought they were kind of playing, that they were imitating the human funerals they'd seen, that they weren't actually having a funeral. So as far as the stories go, as far as we know, they're functionally immortal, unless you take a sword to the head or something.
Yeah. Wow. So they would have to be in the physical, and then they could be killed.
Yes. And that is, I should have mentioned this when we were talking about that checklist. I touched on it a little bit in more detail. It is believed, and it is in all the stories, even the modern ones, that fairies can be physically real in our reality. They can touch you, they can pick things up, they can affect everything around them the same way that you or I would. And then they can choose to not be here anymore.
Yeah, they can bite.
Yeah, they can do all sorts of things.
Now, they would have to be physical because you mentioned earlier they like butter.
Yes.
So eat.
Yeah, it's a very widespread belief. Dairy products in particular are something fairies like. So milk, cream, butter, anything along those lines. Everyone loves ice cream. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Now, there's kind of two schools of thought. There are stories where they physically take the food. Like they take the item away. For example, in Ireland, they're thought to steal the milk from cows. So they'll literally take it. There's also a lot of stories, though, that talk about they don't necessarily physically take it all the time, but they'll take the like essence out of it, the substance, the nutritious value. And usually when that happens, people will notice like food spoils really quickly, milk spoils. It's like all the goodness, the value in it has kind of been sucked out. The way my
Now you
youngest son
mentioned
understands this is they take the soul out of the food.
well,
If that works for you
makes
guys.
sense, makes sense. But you mentioned something earlier. There's a reason why I'm bringing all of this up.
Hmm?
You mentioned earlier about possible sexual encounters
Yes.
and between humans and fairies. And is it the female fairies going after the human men? Is it male fairies going after the human women? Is it both? I don't know. Maybe you can answer that, but I'm asking because it appears that to do that, you've got to be in the physical, but
Yes.
yet they are immortal. Kind of reminds me of a vampire a little bit, but can humans, if they're in this hybrid program, what happens with the offspring? Are they fairies? Are they human? Are they both? And then are they immortal? You know, because if we're going to the physical, we're eating food, we're eating ice cream together,
Yep.
we're having sex, we're having kids.
Yep.
What's going on with the offspring? And are they then immortal?
So I feel like I'm saying there's two of everything right now, but there's
No,
two ways this happens.
there's humans and then there's fairies. So there's
Yeah.
a two stories to every question. There's two answers.
So when it's human women, what usually happens in the story is the human woman gets taken and is not in this world anymore. She goes into the world of fairy, the other world, whatever you want to call it. And not always, but the majority of the time. And then any children would be born there and would be fairies. The other thing which we see, usually if it's a human man, then the fairy comes into this world and becomes the person's wife, and they have children. And usually if the children are born here, they're more human, like they're human children mostly. They usually have a couple particular things about them, but they would be mortal. They would be in this reality. There's actually a story that Jacob Grimm records in his Teutonic mythology, I think volume 4, where he talks about a story he was told about a man who was living on his own in a house. And one day an elf woman came in. She passed through a knothole in the wall is how she entered. So clearly not a human, but then, appeared as this elf woman. She stayed with him. They had 4 children together. And then one day just left the same way she came, went back through the knothole and disappeared. And the children were just fairly normal children. We also have stories of Selkie wives. Now, whether Selkies are considered fairies is debatable, so I'm not going to get into that argument, but Selkies are seal folk. They are seals when they're in the water. They can come out of the water, take off the seal skin, and are human looking inside. And so we have all these stories about this man who would see, this fisherman who would see these Selkies dancing, or a Selkie on the beach, and would steal one of the seal skins. And without that, the woman cannot go back into the water. She can't be a seal again. So she would go and be his wife, give him a bunch of children, and then usually in the stories, one of the children will find the seal skin where it's hidden. And once she has that back, she leaves. She goes back into the ocean and becomes a seal again. And the children usually are left behind.
Wow.
In those cases, though, the children are said they are mortal, but they're said to have a particular affinity for like swimming and fishing in the ocean, kind of coming from that ancestry. Similar stories that we find in Orkney, the children are said to be born with webbed fingers or webbed toes,
Right.
as a sign of this ancestry. So this is a big topic. We could have talked about just this for 2 hours.
Yeah,
There's
no,
a lot
let's
going on
continue.
with it.
This is fascinating to me. And so, what about a fairy woman that comes here takes the man's seed,
Mhm.
right, and goes back. Does that
Yep.
happen?
There's certainly some stories like that. Yeah. There's also some stories of a ferryman who comes and has a human lover, and she gets pregnant, and then he disappears, goes back where he came from. So it can definitely go kind of in different directions with any of this.
Man, how do you explain that to your wife?
There's actually
No.
funny that you mentioned that. There's actually a story, I think this one's also from Orkney, of a man who was married and
Right.
then met this fairy woman and brought
Here
her
we
home.
go. Here we go. I knew
Yep.
it. I knew
Yep.
it. Here we
Brought
go.
her home to be his second wife.
Here we
And
go. All right.
his first wife was not happy. But yeah, so things happen sometimes. Then there's actually, believe it or not, there's actually several Irish families that trace their ancestry back to fairies.
Wow. Wow.
Um,
So you're sitting there. Okay, honey, it's Friday night. I've worked all day. That was a couple thousand years ago, tending the fields.
yeah.
And tonight's our night, it's date night. And I want to introduce you to Faye. Faye, come on in here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, there's all sorts
Wow.
of theories to try to like rationally explain all of this.
You can't. You can't.
Yeah.
You can't.
Yeah.
You know, you're in court, you know, judge. She was a fairy. She's gone. She went back.
Yep, she disappeared.
I don't
Back
know if you
where
can
she
call
came
that
from.
cheating. I don't think I was unfaithful. She was a fairy. She wasn't human, and she's not here. She's gone. You can't even bring her on as a witness.
Yeah, there's surprising number of stories about things like this. The Fitzgerald family in Ireland, they used to be some of the lords down in Limerick. Supposedly, the third Earl's wife was a fairy woman, and his son was the product of the two of them. And it was said she actually left him in this world until he was an adult, and then she came and took him, and he disappeared with her. So yeah,
Now,
there's
if
all
they
sorts
are
of stories.
okay, so fairy woman comes to my house. Okay, she's a fairy. I'm cool with that. How do we communicate, or do we communicate with the language of love? You know what I mean? I mean, how does that happen?
It varies depending on the story. A lot of times the fairies, even though they have their own language, would also speak like the local language, the human language. Not always, but usually. But yeah, there certainly are stories where like she never says a word.
Right.
Words aren't necessary, I guess. In some cases. We'll just say that it's love at first sight because that sounds better.
Do fairies seek out a certain type of human, male and female?
They seem to, although it can be a little difficult for us to understand what the qualities are. Historically, it was, said to be stuff like if you were kind, if you were basically like a good person, they seem to be drawn to that. They prefer people who are fairly neat and clean, over people who are like a hot mess. Although again, there's some range here. They also seem to prefer humans who are a little boundary pushing. A lot of the people who historically in the older stories and the folklore were said to have these connections were people who were kind of known for maybe doing things that weren't as socially acceptable. There was a woman in Cornwall named Anne Jeffreys. This is one of the more famous kind of historical accounts. I want to say this was in the 1700s, who was always considered to be a little odd. a little masculine for a woman. Like she would do things that only generally boys would do. So people kind of looked on her as being a bit eccentric. She had a fit, which we would assume today was a seizure, and then was ill for a while. And when she came out of it, she said that she had seen the fairies and talked to them, and they gave her this healing power. So she could lay her hands on people and heal them. And she kind of got a reputation for this, which the local church authorities did not appreciate. She also was kind of rabble-rousing a bit. But this is the interesting part of her story. She was imprisoned and had said something in her testimony about how the fairies gave her bread every day. The fairies fed her. So the official who imprisoned her ordered her not to be fed. And she was not given any food for over a month and didn't show any signs of being starving or anything like that. And she said the fairies were feeding her every day. And no one could prove that they weren't. There's even one person who she gave some of the fairy bread to I guess prove it was real. So yeah.
I know of a fairy.
Yeah.
You do too. Enya. Enya's a fairy. Yeah. When
I think Bjork is too, to be honest.
What's that?
I think Bjork is too in Iceland.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Bjork possibly.
Something.
No,
Yeah.
Bjork is yeah.
Otherworldly.
I just watched her latest concert, and I'm a big Bjork fan and have been since her first band. But the concert was weird.
Yeah.
It was just weird. Anyway, love Bjork. Enya, though. Enya combines ancient Celtic rhythms and melodies into these modern songs that she writes. And when I listen to her music, I'm a big fan of Enya. I am. I admit it. I love Rammstein. I love Black Sabbath. I do. I'm a heavy metal guy. I likes me some Enya. She's really good. And so when you listen to a whole album of hers, and I've done it. I did it 2 weeks ago. I was on a road trip. I listened to Enya for like 4 hours. Anyway, you can hear the fairy music.
Yeah.
You can hear it. You can hear it. It evokes these thoughts and stuff. Man, I think Enya is a fairy.
I should have added when we were when you asked about which sort of humans or fairies seem to be drawn to, they do tend to really like musicians and artists.
Oh, I believe it.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories about that. There was a really famous musician in Ireland a couple hundred years ago named Turlough O'Carolan. He was blind, and it was said that he slept on the side of a fairy hill and heard the fairy music, and that was what he then recreated.
Started to write. I've heard the story. Yes.
Yeah. And the fairies just seemed to like him. So yeah, if you're a musician, your odds are probably a little bit better. Oh, actually, that reminds me of another story. Really quick, because I know we're coming up on the hour here, but I was in Ireland in 2016 with a friend of mine who's a musician. Sort of a jack of all trades musician, but he plays piano, he plays organ, he plays guitar. Very talented. And the place we were staying at, I was inside the cabin with a couple other friends, and he decided to go for a walk. And it's twilight, which is a time very associated with fairies. And he comes back in, and he's kind of a little shaken up. And we all kind of look at him like, what's going on? And he's like, I was walking by the woods, and these voices started calling me from in among the trees, asking me to join them.
Ooh, do you go? Like, yeah. Do you go? Okay, so you hear it. Do you go?
I mean, I would probably be really tempted. I'm not gonna lie. Like I have no common sense, and I make very poor life choices.
Man,
I'm glad he didn't go.
I've seen this movie.
Yeah.
I've seen this movie. And the speaking of this, the movie Leprechaun,
Mhm.
Leprechaun 2 too was pretty scary. But Leprechaun, that wasn't the leprechauns from the Lucky Charms box.
No.
You know what I
No.
mean? And to portray it, that was an absolute bona fide scary movie.
Yeah.
It was. I know it sounds strange. If you haven't seen it, go and check out Leprechaun. It's not going to be what you expect.
Yeah.
Are there versions of fairies and leprechauns that are like that are just plain evil? Are there
Fairies,
any
yeah.
reports of fairies killing humans?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Leprechauns not specifically, although one of the oldest myths with leprechauns in it, which is 1,000 years old, it starts with them trying to drown somebody.
Right.
But he was kind of in their business, so they were retaliating. For the most part, though, leprechauns they don't have that kind of story to them. But there's a variety of different ones that are known to be predatory towards humans. I mentioned the fairy horses earlier. Ekoski is what they're called. Water horses. Ekoski, yes. I was making sure I was saying that correctly. They look like a horse, but if you get on them to ride them, you can't get off, like you get stuck to them, and they'll run into a body of water because that's where they live, in like lakes and ponds and things, and drown you and then eat you.
Yeah, and you're stuck.
Yeah, basically. Also sometimes called kelpies in Scotland, but same concept. And then you have, other sorts that, are going to have you on the menu. So you have friendly ones, you have mischievous ones that steal your keys and jewelry, and then you have the ones that you really don't want to run into, the more dangerous ones.
It just makes me wonder, how did you, because your knowledge of this is so thorough and deep, and then you have to get into the language part of it, which everything is difficult to pronounce. In fact, Americans say every Irish word wrong and name. It's just something that we do. But how did you get into
It's a separate language,
this?
so it's different phonetics. Yeah.
How did you get into this whole fairy leprechaun folklore mythology, and turn around and start teaching this? How did you get into it?
So growing up the way I did, with a lot of these stories being told to me, and then I felt like I had a lot of experiences when I was a child. I always very strongly believed in them. I was lucky because my family didn't discourage that. Because when you're coming from the Irish diaspora, there does tend to be a little more acceptance of like, okay, these things are possible. And then when I got into my teens, I started researching the folklore and the mythology because I wanted some context. I wanted to understand things. I wanted to feel like I wasn't alone. I wasn't the only person who had weird stuff happen. And then the more I got into it, the more I realized how little I knew. It's one of those subjects that the more you learn, the more you feel like you know nothing about it. There's just so much to it. So at this point, 30 something years in, I've studied quite a bit, and I still feel like there's a lot that I don't know because there's just so much, which is great. I'll study it for the rest of my life, and I'll always be learning new things. I do also translate Old and Middle Irish, so I read a lot of the myths in the original language. I have a little more ability with Irish than the average American.
What a great show tonight. And happy St. Patrick's Day, Morgan. Perfect night on the show. Just thank you. I learned so much. And if I learned something, so did everybody else. Just thank you. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I had a great time.
Happy St. Patrick's Day.
You too.
Perfect night on the show, everybody. Absolutely perfect night. And I want to thank Morgan, and her links are below on our website and throughout social media. So with that, I want to remind everybody, tomorrow night, Chris Matthew is back with us. He's got a new film out, Doors of Perception. So until tomorrow night, all I've got is Go Backly Tappy. Fade to Black is produced by Hilton J. Palm, Renee Newman, and Michelle Freed. Special thanks to Bill, John, Dex, Jessica, Dennis, and Kevin. Webmaster is Drew the Geek. Music by Doug Aldrich. Intro, Space Boy. Fade to Black is produced by KJCR for the Game Changer Network. This broadcast is owned and copyrighted 2024 by Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network, Inc. It cannot be rebroadcast, downloaded, copied, or used anywhere in the known universe without written permission from Fade to Black or the Game Changer Network. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Go Backly Tappy.